lot of people will look around at the problems in their culture and they'll wonder if there's some root problem that is causing everything else. And so they'll notice the political corruption, the widespread greed, the inequality. And many people believe that capitalism is the root problem. It's like if we can just get rid of capitalism, or if we can fix it and make it work the way it's supposed to, then everything will be okay. And I believe that the idea that capitalism is the root problem is a myth. It's not true. And the truth is ridiculous. It's tragically funny for people with a certain sense of humor. And it's also, for me, uplifting. Because we can find the root problem and we can do something about it. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. How can we know that capitalism isn't the root problem? What is the root problem? And what can we do about it to have a culture where everyone feels basically satisfied and everyone can meet their needs? And then what are healthy cultures like that live this way on a regular basis because they recognize that root problem and they avoid it? Sounds good to me. So why would people think that capitalism is the root problem? Well, it turns out there's a lot of evidence that makes that seem like a reasonable belief. So to take my country, the United States, as an example, it's easy for me to look around and see lots of examples of people with less than they need to live a comfortable and secure life, even though they're working hard. And it's also easy to look around and see people with way more than they need who aren't sharing. Or maybe some of them share a teeny bit, but not nearly enough to make a difference. And so what results is a society with a huge amount of wealth, a huge abundance, and at the same time, a huge amount of unnecessary misery. And misery in the midst of abundance sounds like a good tagline for capitalism, right? Someone asked me for a one-liner, misery in the midst of abundance. And if that kind of hoarding was the only problem, that would be bad enough. But unfortunately, this country also has racism, also has sexism, also has political corruption, pollution, child abuse, and more. And it's not just in the United States. Every capitalist country anywhere in the world has those same problems. And in fact, every capitalist country in the history of humanity has those same problems. You look at Turkey, you look at Russia, look at France. All of them have those same problems. And so it's easy for me to see why people might think that capitalism is the root problem. And there's only one trouble with that theory, which is that plenty of countries that aren't capitalist have all those same problems. And so let's take the Soviet Union for an example. That was a country in the 20th century. And the biggest region of the Soviet Union was Russia. And so prior to the founding of the Soviet Union, Russia was a feudalist monarchy for a very long time. And then they switched over into this capitalist phase for a few decades. And then the revolution happened and the Soviet Union was born. And their official name was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And so socialism was part of their identity from the beginning. And they talked about how they were making a workers' paradise, right? A socialist revolution. And they were going to fight the greed and the corruption of the capitalist business owners and the landowners, you know? And that all sounds nice. But when you look at what actually happened, all those same problems were there too, right? The racism, the greed, a few people with more than they need and a lot of people with less, right? The political corruption, the pollution, right? All those problems were there too. And unfortunately, that's not even the most ridiculous part. To me, this is the most ridiculous part, which is that I would read about these social activists or these like political activists in the 20th century. And when I would read about them in the United States or West Germany or France, right, these capitalist countries, these activists would see how all these problems in their capitalist country. And they would show a huge amount of courage and insight and to try to make their culture healthy. And they heard about how much better things were in the communist societies. And so you had these activists in the capitalist countries trying to make their country more like the communists, more like what they thought the communists were like. But then if you go look at the stories of these political activists in the communist countries, you read the same thing, right? They saw how bad things were under communism, right? Whether it was China during the communist phase of the mid 20th century or whether it was the Soviet Union, these activists would see how bad things were. They would see all those same kinds of problems, and then they would hear how much better things were in these capitalist countries. And so they would try to make these activists in the communist countries would try to make their country more like what they heard the capitalists were like. And so you can see these like groups of activists in all these countries all around the world seeing similar problems, trying to make their societies more like the others that all have the same problems. It's like a tragically funny thing, right? It's like ridiculous. And because none of them were going to bring about deep change. None of them. None of those efforts. Like, you can go back and forth from capitalism to communism to socialism and around again as many times as you want, and you will still have sexism. You will still have racism. You'll still have political corruption and all the other problems. And the reason is that all those different economies are profit economies. A profit economy is any economy that rewards selfishness. And so the people that already have more than they need get a lot. The people that have less than they need hardly get anything at all, right? So it's kind of backwards. And, when you think about what profit is, like any business person will tell you, profit is when your income is more than your expenses, right? It means that you're taking more than you're giving. And so a profit economy rewards selfishness. It encourages people to take more from their neighbors than they give back. And the richest ones are the ones that take the most from their neighbors and give the least back. So, whether it's communism or capitalism or socialism or whatever, all those societies have that problem. So if none of those things work, then what could work, right? Does anything work, or are we just screwed and like destined to live in unhealthy cultures as humans? I think a lot of people struggle with despair, because if all you see are things in the world that don't work, right? Like these different cultures that seem different superficially, but they all have these like same deep problems, then I think it's easy to fall into this like depression that like there isn't a viable way to really resolve these problems and build a culture that everyone can find satisfying. So let's talk about that, because it turns out there are healthy cultures. There are ways of living without those deep problems. And so I just wrote a book that is free. It's called One Disease, One Cure. And it has all this research that I've gathered about healthy cultures and unhealthy cultures. It turns out every unhealthy culture I've ever studied has a lot of these same problems. Every unhealthy culture has racism, has sexism, has a few rich and a lot of poor. And guess what? The rich aren't sharing in any of those cultures, right? It has the pollution, has everything, the normal list, you could say. And then the healthy cultures don't have those problems. Healthy cultures don't have racism. They don't have sexism. They don't pollute, And it's really remarkable. And for a long time I wondered, what is the difference? Like how can people, these groups in these countries have all these big problems they can't really deal with, and these groups of people are able to maintain a baseline of mutual respect. Like in each culture, they're able to do that amongst themselves, indefinitely, right? And it turns out that there's a single root problem, a root cultural disease, and that is where a culture has rulers. Whenever a culture has people who impose law on everybody else, and those rulers can choose how the law is enforced, and everyone else just gets to accept that, then all those other problems arise, right? So the sexism and the racism and the corruption and the greed, those are all just symptoms of a root cultural disease where a few people rule over everybody else. And in healthy cultures, they don't have that problem. They everyone agrees on their rules, and anyone can hold anyone else accountable. And so they're able to maintain a culture that maintains a baseline of mutual respect for everybody. And it turns out in healthy cultures, every healthy culture I have ever found maintains some form of a gift economy, right? And so healthy cultures have a huge amount of variety and lots of different ways of life. But there are some common factors, right, that we can pull lessons from. And one of them is about these gift economies. And so a gift economy is any kind of economy that rewards sharing, right, that rewards generosity instead of profit, right? So it encourages people to give more than they're taking. And in the book One Disease, One Cure, I give a ton of examples in lots of different like aspects of a gift economy. But I'd like to just share one example just to give a flavor of what it's like when that deep generosity is the normal way of life. So back in 2015, I got to spend several weeks with the Ashaninka. They live in the Amazon. If you look at a map, it looks like they live in Peru, but maps don't always tell the truth. And the maps about Peru don't tell the truth. So the Ashaninka live in what looks like eastern Peru, but the Peruvian government, the laws don't apply there, right? The Ashaninka don't pay taxes. The Peruvians don't track their land. The Ashaninkans just live amongst themselves, and they choose how to live for themselves. And like I believe every healthy culture, they maintain a gift economy. And so just to pick one example of their incredible generosity, when I was there, I would sometimes travel, across a town or between towns. And I was generally traveling with my host or a group of other people. And whenever we stopped at a home, we would all sit down out in front, and there wouldn't be any question or request. There wouldn't be any sort of opening conversation. Just without any preface, the woman of the household would bring out this big bowl of their pink drink called perensi and some food. And it was the same drink every time, but it was a wonderful drink. It's a pink drink, slightly fermented from the root vegetables. And so it was totally okay. It was the same drink every time. But they would bring the drink and the food out, and maybe we would chat, or maybe we would just sit in silence, whatever people felt like. And then once the group was ready to go, we would just leave. That was it, right? Like I never paid for anything. I never gave the host something back. We would just go. And that was actually hard for me at first, because I'm used to you go to a restaurant and you pay, and you have to pay an amount that everyone agrees is fair. We all agree that this amount of money is a good trade for that amount of food, and so we're going to do that trade. And when I leave, there's no residue, there's no leftover, feelings, right? It's totally fair. But that wasn't the way the Ashaninka live. So everywhere I went, people just kept giving. And I just kept feeling more and more grateful for their generosity. And I kept asking, when do I get to give back? When do I get to share my food or my songs or my knowledge or whatever I have, And luckily, the person that brought me in, his name was Mike, and he'd been going there for decades. And he told me, he said, these are the most generous people you have ever met. And bring them gifts, and no matter how much you bring them, you will wish you brought more. And he was right. Before I went to spend that time with the Ashaninka, I went to this small Peruvian town, and I practically cleaned it out. Man, I filled a big bag full of stuff like knives, sewing material, fishing material, all kinds, anything that I thought that they might value. I filled up the sack, and I felt like Santa Claus. I had a big pile of stuff, and I took it in there, and I gave it all away. And sure enough, Mike was right. By the end of it, I wished I had more, because they were so generous. And to me, it felt incredibly special because I'm not used to that. But I actually think that level of generosity is normal in healthy cultures. And so what's it like? I have a hard time talking with people about what it would really be like to have that depth of generosity be normal. And so I'd like to make an analogy here that I think could help a lot of people resonate with it. The Haudenosaunee are a healthy culture that live in what most Americans recognize as the New York State region, roughly. And for many centuries, they were able to live in a fully traditional way. And so the Haudenosaunee is a confederacy of nations. One of those nations is the Mohawk, and a collection of Mohawk writers put out a book called A Basic Call to Consciousness. And they talk about how they would choose their spiritual leaders to also be their political leaders, right? So which I think is actually what it means to have leaders that the whole society actually wants to follow. So, and they said it really clearly. Their leaders were the ones, like they said a lot of things about leaders, right? Not to oversimplify, but their leaders were the ones who could build abundance and then share it. And then by putting them into leadership, that helped encourage everyone to share generously and to make sharing the norm. And when I read that, so I have a Christian background, and I grew up in a Christian family, and my first thought when I read that was, oh, making your spiritual leader also your political leader. Like, what if Jesus Christ was the political leader of his people, right? So I know not all the viewers of this video are Christian, and I'm not about to start preaching to anybody, but I'd like to talk about this example and make it applicable to everybody, right? So Jesus Christ, many Christians recognize him as the Son of God, but a lot of like Muslims and Jews recognize Jesus Christ as a prophet. And so a huge number of people recognize Jesus as someone that is worth learning lessons from. And Jesus Christ was known, among other things, he was known for giving away all of his things and encouraging his followers to do that. And he even said it's really spiritually important that you give away all of your things. And so what would it be like if Jesus Christ, what would it be like if the Romans had just gone away and instead of killing Jesus Christ? Like, what if the Romans just disappeared? And so Jesus Christ had huge numbers of followers who listened to him talk. What if they had been free to live by themselves, and the followers had been able to make Jesus Christ be their political leader? And Jesus Christ could have worked with everybody to make that level of generosity, that level of sharing that Jesus preached, the norm among the whole culture, right? Where everyone is showing that level of generosity so that Jesus doesn't even stand out, right? And you might think that's a bizarre fantasy, but I actually think that level of generosity is just normal in healthy cultures. And so, let's imagine that you were in that kind of healthy culture, right? That has widespread generosity, where sharing is the norm, where Jesus Christ himself wouldn't stand out, right? Like someone that people have worshipped for thousands of years, in part because of how incredibly generous he was. Like, that level of generosity is just like a normal amount of generosity, right? What would be the big threat to that culture of deep sharing? Well, in every healthy culture that I have ever studied, they say the same thing. Selfishness would be the big threat to that culture of sharing. And so every healthy culture I've studied takes a lot of care to notice whenever selfishness arises, whenever someone starts acting that way, and help them deal with that so they can feel comfortable sharing again. And, to give one example, Robin Kimmerer is a Potawatomi woman, and she wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she talks about how people were, sharing was the normal way of life when the Potawatomi were able to live in a fully traditional way. And if someone started showing selfishness, they were counseled early on. And I would think, someone would ask them, like, are you feeling uncomfortable? Are you angry with someone? Like, do you not trust? Like, we're sharing with you, like, what's going on? And I would imagine that the counseling would usually work because it feels good to be in a society where everyone shares. But if that didn't work, what Kimmerer said is that they would basically escalate, and they would maybe ostracize, and it would keep going from there. And different healthy cultures have different ways of dealing with it, and there are lots of different beautiful things they talk about. But ultimately, you keep escalating. If that selfishness stays, in somebody and they don't stop acting selfishly, eventually the healthy culture will banish that person or even kill them if their selfishness is too hurtful, right? But whatever they have to do, they will do to make sure that selfishness doesn't take hold. Because it's really hard to have a culture of sharing when someone keeps taking and not giving back. And so, what's the lesson from that? Well, what is the problem with having rulers in unhealthy cultures? Well, rulers are the most selfish ones. They're the ones that take the most and give the least back. They're the ones that make the laws and enforce them however they want so that they reward selfishness. Like selfish rulers reward selfishness in other people. And that's basically how profit economies happen, right? That's how a culture ends up embracing selfishness as a normal, like necessary way of life, is because people are trapped with rulers, and rulers are selfish, and then rulers basically encourage selfishness in everyone else. And what that means is that the way to generate a healthy culture is the same way to generate an economy of sharing, and that is to make a culture where nobody rules over anybody else. And that ultimately is what my book is about. One Disease, One Cure. It's a free book, and if you'd like to learn more about what unhealthy cultures are like and what healthy cultures are like and what it would take to go from an unhealthy culture to a healthy culture, I welcome you to get your own copy for free right now. It's available at onedisease-onecure.com.